Hello all, I hope you're doing well today. I was chatting with a subscriber on the Substack, as I tend to do most days. People ask me questions about life, my work, what's going on with them, and we got into a conversation about traditionalism. Now, when I say traditionalism, I take it at this point, I don't mean conservatism, I mean the philosophical spiritual school of traditionalism, which a lot of my work is aligned with. And this fella's kind of getting the hang of it, but just wanted some clarification. So I said, look, I'll answer this in a video where other people may well benefit because it's getting quite convoluted and I can just clear it all up now. And again, I am in the middle of a course on traditionalism at the moment, sort of the foundations of traditionalism, just to give people a solid basis to understand where I'm working from, but also understand themselves, their civilization, their culture, and the cultures of the world, as well as life itself and sacred order in a much deeper way. That will, of course, have discounts for all Substack subscribers and early bird discounts and so on. Hopefully, can have something getting towards ready by the end of the month. But anyway, to contextualize what we're speaking about here, I was saying to this fella on Substack, traditional truths aren't just something you argue over. They're seen as the fundamental truths of life in the perennial philosophy. Every tradition, if you like, harks back to these fundamental truths. At differing levels in the cycle, they understand them in different ways or don't understand them. But the point is they're written into being. So the response from this guy is, so traditional truths are truths full stop. Maybe a good question to ask would be the following. Is there a difference between tradition, Jungian archetypes and reality as it is? It seems to me that this is a key question. Are these psychological or do they represent the way the world is actually structured? At which point metaphysical claims can come into play. Basically, is it reducible to Jordan Peterson? Very good question, very common question, and one that the modern mind will ask. Now, again, we have to start from the very beginning. Being itself has a sort of sacred order, if you will, implicitly implied within it. This is very different from the classical New Age schools or these ideas of modern non-duality. We sort of function around this idea of, you break the illusion of the individual self and then you enter nirvana or enlightenment or the kingdom of heaven, to use Christian esoteric language. And you have the true realization that real life is just the presence of God or the presence of being. And we're trapped in the small self experience, or at least trapped in it without understanding. We hark back to something deeper. Traditionalism would say a lot of this is true, but it adds something very important in that there's an innate structure to being. Certain truths are written into being which define a harmonious civilization. And if you move away from those, as traditionalists would argue the Western world has, you create a chaotic, material reality. And in some senses, people say, well, yeah, but we've made so much progress in the modern world. How can you say that? And a traditionalist would say, well, yes, you have, but you've lost your heart and soul in doing so. And of course, this maps on perfectly to so many famous spiritual teachings. Jesus Christ, lay up for yourselves in heaven your treasures. Don't lay up work on the worldly treasures. That they're not really going to satisfy you. It's about your heart and your soul, and alignment is what really matters in the final analysis. That's a fundamental spiritual teaching, and as I explore in my videos all the time, you see what happens when you move away from that. So if we immediately start with that basis, we can then make a distinction between Jungian archetypes and that understanding. So traditionalism, if you like, would say it just is reality as it is and aligns with the sacred rhythms and orders of said reality that are implicit in being. Jungian archetypes that Jordan Peterson would work in are a break away from that. A lot of the key traditionalists, especially Guénon and Evola, would really say that psychology in and of itself is something of a limitation of modernity because it's bringing truth down to the level of the human mind. And again, if you remember with traditional truths, which are higher spiritual truths, or at least point to those, it would say something more like you let go to the implicit truths of being and you're guided by those, if you will, via a harmonious civilizational and personal spiritual structure. So again, already when we get to Jung, it's already declined massively because we're on the level of the mind. I think Evola in Ride the Tiger speaks a bit about how Jung's work is rooted in Freud. Freud's work is rooted in the idea of the subconscious. The subconscious is almost this dark, unknown netherworld, if you like, where all of our shadows are hidden and demons are hidden. And in some senses, you could say that's legitimate. to face these things. But where someone like Evola or Guénon would say that's limited is you're still creating this dark, divided structure at the root of reality rather than the sacred order. So they would say already you're falling into the world of the mind, in Nietzschean language, a human, all too human world. And in essence, when you say is it reducible to Jordan Peterson, no, it's not. Traditionalists would say people like Jung and Peterson are pointing slightly outside of the realms of modernity and towards the true depth of mythology, but they get stuck in the mind. Peterson much worse than Jung. Jung, to be fair to him, does do the best out of all of the moderns in many ways of moving beyond it, but it's fundamentally still rooted, if you like, in the mind and the subconscious. Peterson himself, you can see the problem with him is he's always trying to work everything out. And I shouldn't be mean to Peterson because I understand he's unwell again at the moment. And I think we all, wish him well and all that sort of stuff. And, he's done some really important work. But as I've said many times, a problem with Peterson, as you can tell, he's trying to work it all out with his mind all the time, which is a symptom of modernity, i.e. every truth must come under the microscope, otherwise it cannot be real. And this is why, it ends up for Peterson being this long labyrinthian journey through sort of evolutionary psychology and psychology itself and religious mythology. But there's an element of life in the spiritual journey, and certainly the traditional journey, where you have to let go to higher wisdom, where you have to let go of the mind. And it could, obviously, in this day and age, how stupid are you? It's all about anti-intellectualism if you let go of the mind. But they're not saying you let go of the mind not to open yourself up to truth. They're saying you let go of the mind because you realize the mind has reached its limit, and there are certain things that you can't understand via the mind that only alignment with true sacred order can show you. So in essence, this would be a problem. It's not reducible to Peterson, and traditionalism is certainly several steps outside of that. I mean, traditionalism itself, through its generic theory, I say generic because there are different traditionalists who think differently, but they'd even say the trouble started with people like Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And they'd say, again, the problem with that is you're mistaking thinking for the fundamental reality of being, but it's not. Being's fundamental, not thinking. So again, this is complex stuff, but it's very easy once you understand it. It's just spirit first, and there's an aligned order with spirit. This is, of course, the central claim of all the religions down the years too, obviously. But he continues on with this question, which will obviously demystify this more for us. So he says, from what I can see, the traditionalists say the spiritual space is reality. To an extent, yes. But what that spiritual reality includes is a really interesting question. Again, we sort of covered that already. There's an implicit hierarchy written into being that has to be aligned with, if you like. Then he states we can acknowledge Christ teaches deep truths about masculinity and femininity. Questionable. But he carries on, in terms of sex, and even more so in terms of the classical view of form, masculinity, actuality, and matter, femininity, potentiality. Not really. We're getting a bit mixed up here. When we speak about masculinity, actuality, femininity, potentiality, it's very good you've picked up on that. But that tends to be more of a generic traditionalist reading across cultures. So again, you'll find the feminine is Mother Earth, mother is matter in Latin and so on. So it has this grounding in the earthly nature. Masculinity, again, is the more spirit nature, it's the sun, if you will. So again, Christ doesn't really speak about that so much unless you're looking for it. And the Christian tradition doesn't really speak about it so much other than implies it, obviously, with God the Father. So again, these are more traditional terms you're speaking about rather than Christian-specific ones, and certainly not things Christ speaks about. As I say, if you look at Christ, he speaks in principles. He very rarely speaks in exact political terms, and he wants to speak in principles because the idea is you become awakened to the truth and you follow it yourself via the inner spiritual awareness that you need. Anyway, he goes on, but how does traditionalism deal with Christ's claim to be God or various other Christian claims? Or are the only spiritual teachings that are common across traditions true? Well, again, it depends which traditionalists you will talk to, because you will get more Christian sympathetic traditionalists. Guénon was famously more sympathetic to Christianity than Evola. Schuon was, I think, pretty much a Christian. Marcia Eliade. Some people see him as more traditionalist adjacent, but he was orthodox, I think. But anyway, the point is, yeah, I mean, there would be different lines on it, but in essence, traditionalism would say, again, because there's one sacred order, they would understand Christianity differently to the mainline Christian who says, Christ is just God. In the sense of, Evel is very clear on this in Revolt Against the Modern World, where he would argue that the old world, if you like, he would call the Golden Age, blurred the line between God and man. So man could almost take on higher qualities, if you like, and he viewed that as a higher virtue or a more virtuous civilization. Whereas he's very clear, as the religions and the spirituality throughout time starts to come more to the modern era, we see that split between man and God fall apart further and further. So he would see the traditional mainstream interpretation of Christianity as blocking man from God, blocking man from the divine. And again, he'd say that that's led to the modern world where everything's scientism and materialistic because we've lost the sacred. Now, he wouldn't necessarily say that's what Christianity itself is claiming, but he'd say that's what our modernist understanding of it is claiming. Esoteric Christianity would say something like you can unify with God completely because all you really are is God's energy in essence. Doesn't mean that you won't still be, little old John living his life, but you understand your root, your energy, being, consciousness, life comes from God. That's the real source of all life. And again, science can't really challenge that claim because it can't tell us where life comes from, So again, if you understand it through that sense, through the Hindu language, Christ would be seen as an avatar. Some of the more Hindu sympathetic traditionalists may see it in that way. I think it's Kumaraswamy. He's a Sri Lankan, or he was from the Hindu tradition, but a traditionalist. I'm sure he'd see Christ more as the avatar type figure. That's someone who embodies the divine light in a given time, civilization. And some traditionalists who are Christian sympathetic would see Christ, if you like, as the Godhead. But if you like, it would be the manifestation of the Logos, as Christ claims. So it's almost, again, whether they would view it literally or symbolically, isn't so much the point. They would just view it as the truth has come into the world, something like that. And it would be a symbolic of how the truth can also come into you as an individual as well. So again, they wouldn't take Christian claims literally. They'd look at them in the context of sacred order. And again, this is why you get different takes on them. Famously, Guénon was more sympathetic to Christianity, although still had his issues with it. He believed that the Christian tradition in the West needed an injection of spiritual truth from the East. You could argue that's happening now. Because he felt it's lost its sacred centre, it's lost its esoteric mystical side, and it's all become about practicality and sort of cold, hard moralism, which is a degenerated form of religion. As well, though, you'd have people like Evel, who, to refer to your earlier points on masculinity and femininity, would see Christianity as more of a feminine religion. He'd say it's very lunar, and that it's very much about, dying on the cross, not attacking your enemies, laying down your weapons, these sorts of things. Evel has a much more of a Nietzschean energy within him. It's almost like a warrior energy. So he's more fond of, if you like, the Roman pagan religions and those that preceded that, because he viewed them as more warrior-oriented, overcoming. Now, again, I'm sure you can imagine there's lots of debate and disagreement about that. People saying he's got a chip on his shoulder about Christianity. He's misunderstood elements. He doesn't understand early Christianity. What about the Crusades? What about God the Father? Again, all valid counter-arguments. But the point is that I'm trying to get at is traditionalists will understand Christianity in different ways. Some may take a very literal line that you'll get from the mainstream church. Many won't. Many will take more of an esoteric line. So again, and when we say the spiritual teachings are the spiritual teachings across different traditions true or in common true, well, it depends. It depends because again, there are many different spiritual teachings that, you'd have in common and they work along different levels and layers. But again, it's up to us to look into these and find the crossover. Famous one that we all see in many different traditions is almost dying to the small self, the egoic self, the lower self, the mind, in order to recognize, if you like, a higher truth. That's the true meaning, in my eyes, of the Christian line to be born again. Of course, in a modern degenerated age like today, it just means, I believe in Jesus now, and I'll go and get, baptize in my local church and attend church once a week. That's not what it would really mean in the deeper spiritual context. It means you've recognized your old identity is completely fictional, or at least illusory, and your true identity is something much deeper. Now, of course, we find that in the Buddhist tradition. Buddha sees the suffering of the world. He can't bear it. He does everything to try and overcome it, but in the end kind of gives in and just says, all right, just whatever, and sits beneath the Bodhi tree and finds enlightenment. Again, it's another form of submission, same as Christ on the cross, giving yourself. Again, even Islam, the word means, some interpret it as peace, some as submission. And of course, that doesn't play well into the modern anti-Islamic movement, who just see it as, an orderly submission beneath a worldly power. And again, that's true. That's a degenerated form of Islam. But the higher spiritual truth would be the same thing. You're submitting beneath the higher force, So again, it's really how we understand these things through our own context. And I know I might sound a little bit vague, but the reason I am playing it this way is because I don't just want to say this is the case. I want to try and offer an understanding of how traditionalists think and how traditionalism works, so you can apply it through your own understanding. And don't worry about not understanding it all straight away. Don't worry if it seems a bit strange. It takes time to understand these things. It's not just another idea amongst ideas. Traditionalism, of course, has a philosophical tradition, but it's a real living practice. All of the traditionalists embodied themselves in some tradition. Guénon became a Sufi. Sufism is a mystical school of Islam. It's very popular with many traditionalists. And you'll find that people do adhere to their traditions very rigidly because they want to find where the spiritual truth is. Some of them even engage in martial arts traditions and so on. But the idea is they're not doing it because they want to show off. They're doing it because they want to align deeply with spiritual truth. And that's what really matters. In fact, this is where my interest comes from. There are many big intellectuals on YouTube talking about traditionalism in very expansive ways that will go beyond what I can tell you. But I often listen to them and I think, yeah, you're an intellectual though. I've lived some of this because I was a real screw up in my early life. So I had to find what these sacred truths are and go through lots of these experiences. So my approach to traditionalism is somewhat different you get from other people's who are basically intellectuals. With me, it's more of a heartfelt spiritual practice, although I am open to the intellectual side more as a student. But as I say, it's how do you apply this in your life in practical terms, which aligns you with higher sacred order. As I say, don't worry about it not making sense straight away. There's a course, hopefully out within a week or two, that will explain this in a lot more of a deeper context for you. And with that, really allow you to ground yourself, not just in an intellectual understanding, but begin a spiritual practice rooted in these traditional truths. And which way you take that fundamentally will depend upon you. But I want to give you the foundation upon which you can build. So that's all coming down the line. As always, do let me know what you think down below and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.